Hi there. 2022 R1 adds load balancing to the web client. In earlier versions, you started the web client server once on one server, and you can still do that. That hasn't changed. But for larger loads, we've added the option to spread your web client out with multiple instances on multiple servers. Now, there are three parts to the web client cluster operation. The cluster server handles the requests to and from the web page, and it manages things like security and translations. These services are stateless and very lightweight. One cluster server is required, and we don't suggest that you use more than two, one for backup. The cluster servers use a mechanism called a session pool load balancer to spread the connections out among several session pools. The session pools are stateful, meaning they maintain the connection to the application instance. These session pools handle the configuration and access to COBOL's libraries, fonts, things like that. And the administration console has changed to be easier to use and to handle the administration of these clusters and session pools. It's still the central place where you can view all connections to all cluster servers and session pools. And you can also view your users' screens and take control of them. Now, these three parts communicate through WebSockets, just as they did in 2021 R2, and they all use a secret key for security in their configuration file. The web client has its own installation setup now, apart from the SDK. This is the one for Linux and Unix on the screen, and there's the one for Windows. One thing that you won't be prompted for during installation is the license. The application server will check the runtime license to make sure that it's web client enabled, and it'll keep count. For instance, if you have 100 runtime licenses and 50 are web client enabled, then in your combination of 100 thin client and web client connections, no more than 50 can be web client sessions. It also means that the license file needs to be available to the application server, not the web client servers. There are three properties files, one for each of the three parts discussed earlier. WebClient.properties is used for the cluster server. It's usually just the secret key, a 128-character string that is common to all three of the properties files, and it connects them, while preventing other servers from accessing your web client network through the WebSockets. There are a lot of random generators available. I use the one from this website by Hal Keen. Web Client Session Pool Properties is the one read when you start the session pools. It includes a name for that particular session pool, the URL of the cluster server or servers, and your SSL security trust store and key stores if you use one, and of course the secret key. And WebClient-admin properties hasn't changed from the previous versions. It too holds the WebSocket URL of the cluster server or servers and the secret key, and it also includes a common or public URL name. Now, one more change is needed in the cluster server's configuration file where it points to the admin console URL. You'll need to put the address of your admin panel there. There's a lot of different services and wrapper names to remember, so here's a breakdown of the ones that you might need. First, if you only need one web client server, just as in the past, you can start the service from a command prompt using WebClient or as a service using WebClient. If instead you want to use the load balancing and start a combination of cluster and session pool servers, then you would use WebClient-cluster and WebClient-session from the command line, or Web Client Cluster and Web Client Session services. And to start the administration panel, use WebClient-admin from a command prompt and WebClient-admin to start the service. So let's get started and set one up. So I have the application server running on an AWS Ubuntu Linux, and the first thing that you do before you start setting up the web client is you make sure you can run it with Thin Client. So I'll double click on this link to make sure that I can run it in Thin Client. And there it is. Great. We can move forward. So on that same computer, I'm going to start by starting the cluster server. When you install the web client in more than one computer, you want to make sure that you install them in the same folder that's named the same. So I put mine into the root is COBOL, and here we are. And then we're going to go to Web Client folder, and then there's a folder called Cluster, and we're going to go into the cluster server. Now, if you remember from the slides, we need to modify the WebClient.properties that it uses. So let's look at that. And we need to give it a good secret key. So I have one prepared. And that's all we need to do in this file. So we'll save it. And remember that the other one that we need is the web client server config. And we need to change this localhost to the name of the server. And that's my name for this AWS server. I'll save it. And then we'll go down to the bin directory. And we will start WebClient Cluster. And it's started. We'll go to the next step. Now, the next step is to start a session pool. I'm going to start one on this same computer. So we'll go to the Web Client folder, Cluster, and this time we're going to go to the Session Pool folder. So we need to look at the Properties file and make some adjustments. And we'll start with the secret key. It's the same secret key that I used. We need to give this session pool a name, uncomment that, and we'll make it Session Pool 1. And then the last thing we need to do is tie the session pool to the cluster server. We do that at the WebSocket URL. And there's my address there. We'll write this. And now we can start the session pool. And here we can see it's successfully connected to the cluster server. Now the last thing I want to do on this computer is to start the administrative panel. So again, we'll go to Web Client, but this time we'll go to the admin. And this part hasn't changed from the earlier versions of Web Client. We need to modify the Web Client admin properties. We'll start with the secret key, and we'll change the two URLs. And this one down here. I'll save this file, and then we'll go back to the bin directory, and we'll start WebClient admin. And we can see here that we have the admin panel started. So that's good for the first computer. I have another AWS computer, and in here I'm going to start a second session pool. So I've only installed the session pool here. So you'll see that we just have the cluster folder, and in the cluster folder we only have the session pool. And we're going to go to the Web Client Session Pool Properties. And again, we'll need our secret key. And we need to name our session pool. I'll make this one 2. And we need to connect it to the cluster server here with the WebSocket URL. So I'll write that, go back to the bin, and we'll start the web client session. And we can see here that it's successfully connected to our cluster server. So now we have a cluster server, 2 session pools, and an admin console. So now we're going to go to that administrative panel and log in with admin. And you can see that we have 2 session pools, and there they are set out there. And that's the overview. So let's go to the applications, and we'll start a new application, create a new one called WebC Demo. And I'll click on that. And the first thing we do is assign the session pools to this application. And then I'm going to go to the Web Config section and change the security to None. And in the App Config section, we will put the server address, the name of the program, and apply it. We'll enable this application. Then let's open up our first connection to it. 8080/WebC Demo. And there's our application. Let's go back to the panel and look at our sessions, and we do have one session running. I'll click on it. There's some statistics for it. And if we go to the overview, we can see that it's been assigned to session pool 1. So let's open up a second one in a different browser. We'll put our address in, 8080/webcdemo. And there's our second application. We'll go back and take a look, and now it says that we have 2 connections and 2 active users. And down here it's showing one is assigned to session pool 1 and one is assigned to session pool 2. And we can look at both of the sessions here. Now, you can still use this panel, just as you did before, to control or to view a user session. If you click on it here, you'll see that there's a mirror view. Click on the mirror view, and now I can see my second session, and I can turn on control, and I'll switch it to paged grid. So let's take a look at that second session and make sure that it's been changed. And it is on paged grid. So there's a quick look at the load balancing or clustering feature of WebClient in 2022 R1. I hope you give it a try, and as always, if you have questions, you can find us at support@variant.com. Thank you.